I'm Melanne Verveer, and I'm so thrilled to be joined by the Honorable Hillary Clinton, the 67th U.S. Secretary of State, and by Her Excellency, Sheikha Hind bint Hamad Thani, the Vice Chairperson and the CEO of the Qatar Foundation. We are so pleased to be with both of you, and welcome to you both. Today, we are going to be discussing a more inclusive world, a bold agenda for female leadership. And I'd like to begin with Secretary Clinton, if I might. Madam Secretary, we have all been experiencing and continue to experience the terrible impacts of the pandemic. COVID has affected everyone, but it has disproportionately affected women and exposed those deep inequalities that persist, that we're seeing more clearly than ever. And these inequalities, of course, extend to economic impacts that have been rather severe. Can you talk some about that, as well as how we can take this terrible experience and build back better, both economically and in other ways for the benefit of all of society?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Verveer, and it is a great pleasure for me to join you and Your Excellency for this important forum. And I appreciate that first question because I think it is something that all of us should be paying close attention to. I can speak more from my own experience and observation here in the United States, but the issues that I will mention briefly are prevalent globally. Because of the pandemic, many of the jobs that women held were either eliminated or ended because of quarantine and lockdown, or they were deemed essential jobs, such as in healthcare or necessary retail establishments. So women were both losing their jobs in disproportionate numbers during the pandemic, and they were being forced to try to sustain a job without the support of a school that had been shut down or a child care center that also had been shut down. So the bottom line through much of the world is that the pandemic certainly affected everyone, regardless of who we are or where we live, and it continues to do so very sadly, but it disproportionately impacted women. So we saw the economic inequality. We also saw the extra responsibilities that women shoulder because of our role as caregivers, both in our own families and particularly to our children, but also in many instances for our parents or grandparents who were at particular risk because of the dangers of the coronavirus. That burden on top of everything else, which women were having to, again, disproportionately bear, has left a lot of repercussions. And then, of course, we saw in too many places decisions being made because of the impact of the pandemic that led to an increase in child marriage again, to an increase in domestic violence. So there's a lot that we have laid bare because of this pandemic that demonstrates once again that often problems and crises which affect all of humanity disproportionately affect women. So as we try to come out of this pandemic, or in places in much of the world where the pandemic is still raging, both governments and businesses and the not-for-profit sector have to be particularly attentive to making sure that women's lives and the burdens that they have shouldered are recognized. And I really applaud our new administration, the Biden-Harris administration in the United States, for understanding that and taking some bold steps, including an increase in something we call the child tax credit that will provide essential economic assistance to a lot of families that are still nowhere near back to normal. And that's particularly true of single parent families where the mother has to be both the caregiver and caretaker as well as the income producer. So I hope everyone, governments, businesses, and the not-for-profit sector understand that we have a lot to do to try to create some sense of recovery for so many millions, tens of millions of women across the world.
Your Excellency, I wonder if you can take us to Qatar and tell us what impacts you have seen, but also as the head of a foundation that works so effectively in so many countries, perhaps the impacts that the foundation is hearing about and is concerned about. And I know you're also interested in how it has affected women and their careers. So we'd love your perspective on all of this.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be between both of you and share some of my perspective and my own experience. In Qatar, just like any other country, the effect the pandemic has had on everyone is really, I mean, it's something that it will take us years to understand. Personally, from my own perspective, having 5 children who are in school and needing to support them in their schooling when schools had to shut, and at the same time working from home, that was a challenge. And I understand that because I'm in a position of authority, I'm also in a position of privilege. And to think about other women around the world who do not have the resources available to support their children it just shows that the current system and the system before the pandemic wasn't working for women. And that's something that we have to think about, and it's time to make a change. Why do we have to divide our work from our family life? That's not how we operate. That's not how we operated previously. And to think about women in history, when we think about our own Islamic history, where in the 10th century, more than 30% of scholars were women. And there's an interesting manuscript on the margins of it. A woman wrote that she was apologizing for any mistakes that she had made in the transcription because she was cradling her child while writing with her right hand. And these show that before the divide between work and life didn't really exist. And I think us trying to be more like men is not useful for the communities that we want to build and the role that we need to have in the lives of our children and supporting our communities. And of course, that doesn't just go for women, it also goes for men and the role that they have to play as fathers. And so I hope that today we take the time to reflect and understand what role we play as non-governmental organizations, as government, as private sector, in really changing the framework of work and understanding that it really wasn't working for women in the first place. When we talk about the gender pay gap, or we talk about maternity leave, these are things or topics that continuously come up, and it shows us that we haven't resolved that problem. And I think by trying to equate or put men and women on the same line is not really resolving the issue. And we need to have that flexibility and understand that even us as women, we're different mothers, we're different, even fathers are different, the way that they want to contribute or the way that they want to organize their lives. And so we have to be able to have that flexibility, and it's important for us to really understand that the impact of women not being involved in the children's lives and not being involved in their own lives in a way that is productive and meaningful is going to destruct our communities in the future, and it's time to change it.
could I just add on to what Sheikha Hind just said, because I think
Please.
it's a really critical observation. You know, every person has a right to live up to his or her God-given potential. We want it for our children, both our boys and our girls. We want it for adults. But we make it really difficult for people to manage and integrate making a living and having a life. And of course, having a life, which includes family life, which includes, you know, all of the joys and challenges of family life, at the end of the day is really the goal of it all. So I hope that what Her Excellency just said will be heard, because we impose a penalty on many women for trying to fulfill their own potential while also wanting to be wives and mothers and caregivers. And we need to figure out how to better organize our societies and our economies so that more people, particularly more women, have a chance both to, you know, fulfill their own aspirations, but equally, if not more importantly, to fulfill their personal goals and desires of, you know, being embedded in a family and a community.
You're so right, both of you. This topic is so critically important, and that struggle for balance in our lives. So thank you for touching on it so eloquently. I want to turn to education, because the pandemic has also had a very negative impact on education. We've seen in many countries great progress for girls who've been marginalized in the past, where they're now in school, but as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns that Her Excellency mentioned, they have been out of school trying to help their families. And in the process, many are now the victims of abuse, trafficking, child marriage, and other problems. And there's great worry that they will not return to school. Maybe again, I could start with you, Secretary Clinton, because I know you focused so much on these kinds of issues in the past, and to hear how we might now resolve again in Building Back Better to ensure that we won't have this huge deficit to the girls, to our countries, to our economies, with their not returning to school.
Well, I worry about that a lot for all of the reasons that you just mentioned. There are a lot of reports that we're now seeing from around the world that because of schools shutting down, girls are not only out of school, but there's some doubt as to whether, depending upon their age, they will be returned to school or perhaps put to work or perhaps married. And we also have discovered the great digital divide in many countries, where the effort to try to sustain learning through virtual learning was less than successful in many places, because the children didn't have access to the kind of technology and internet access that they needed. So we have uncovered some very serious issues. Plus, as Her Excellency pointed out, a lot of mothers and some fathers were having to become teachers in the home, having to supervise the schoolwork. I've had many people say to me, I really now for the first time understand how hard a teacher works, because keeping their attention, keeping them on task, you know, keeping them learning was not an easy undertaking. So I do think that as schools reopen, whether they're open now or aiming to reopen in the fall, every precaution should be taken, because we know most young children will not have been vaccinated by then. So we still have to be, you know, sufficiently protective of them. But every precaution should be taken to try to get children back into school, back into the actual classroom. And I think that communities now understand how much more they need to support education. And I think it's a great example that we have from Qatar about the way that education has really been emphasized there. So I would love to hear from Her Excellency, because she truly is an expert in education and has helped to, you know, really make possible what Qatar has achieved.
So, Your Excellency, maybe you can take up right now the Secretary's question, because we're all so familiar with the extraordinary work your country has done and the foundation has done on education. And I wonder if you could speak more broadly about this commitment and this priority. I'm very familiar with Education City, so it has affected all of us in many ways.
Absolutely. The fact that our country has valued education is the very reason why we see the drastic enhancement in education, and we see the value that people put in education as well. Now, with the pandemic, there are many lessons learned, and some of them are positive, but of course some of them are negative. During this time, we've done a lot of research to understand what has worked and what are the things that schools did really well prior to the pandemic that we've missed out on. So again, speaking as a mother, I noticed that my children socially were affected because the spontaneous, playground conversations that they would have were completely taken away. But at the same time, we know through studies that bullying, which affected academic achievements in some students, because that was extracted, their academic achievements were enhanced. And so understanding how to create an environment for learning post-pandemic will be important to ensure what worked prior and during the pandemic. And at the same time, I would like to also add that one thing I noticed in my own children is a sense of calm, because I was around them more. And so again, understanding how to allow parents to be part of the school culture and building that community around the school is critical. We shouldn't think of schools as institutions taken away from family life. If anything, it should be completely incorporated in our family life, because it's important for us to understand how our children are doing and to feel like we're part of that community as well, because parents have to be engaged in their children's education. Otherwise, they miss out, not only parents, but also the children. And so how can we build these communities in our schools and in our country to ensure that the learning opportunities for our kids continue and they don't stop at the gates of the school?
Thank you for that wisdom also. And let me just turn quickly as the clock winds down to probably the existential threat of our time, climate change. It's having terrible impacts that we're already seeing. And we know that women who are at the socioeconomic levels that many are, those margins in many places, are already losing their livelihoods. Displacement is becoming an issue. What can we do collectively to ensure that we don't view women, particularly in places that are already hard hit, just as victims, but see them as problem solvers? And just generally, how can we engage more in ensuring that access to the kinds of tools that they will need to lead a better life despite this terrible challenge?
Well,
Secretary
Melanne,
Clinton, you start.
I'm actually encouraged because more and more women, particularly young women, are becoming very active and outspoken about the threat of climate change. I had the opportunity just last week to speak with Greta Thunberg and two other young climate activists about the work that they are doing to try to not only raise visibility, but to persuade decision makers in every government in the world, as well as in the boardrooms of corporations, to take this threat seriously, because of course they're the ones who will live through the most dire consequences of what climate change can bring. And I think a lot of women around the world have been emboldened, even enlisted to be more active. I think about the late Nobel Peace Prize winner, Wangari Maathai, who pioneered the planting of trees in Africa. And, you know, when she started, people didn't know what she was really trying to do. And she enlisted, you know, legions of women across parts of Africa to plant trees because she knew that it was one way that she could very visibly take a stand against climate change. Well, there are so many other ways that all of us can do something. And I think that it's important to listen to young people about this because in my observation over the last years, they seem to really understand deeply in their hearts why this issue is an existential issue. And particularly if you go to parts of the world that are already suffering from rising sea levels or increased frequency and intensity of storms, you know, there's just a growing awareness that this really may be our last chance. And I was very pleased and grateful that President Biden made sure the United States went back into the Paris Accord, that there will be some important meetings this year to try to figure out what countries can and will do. So I hope that, there is a growing global commitment to trying to do what we can do and do it in a smart way so that, economic opportunities are still readily available through mitigation, through new forms of energy and all of the other aspects of a sensible global climate policy. But clearly, time is of the essence, and there needs to be increased awareness and attention and action paid to it.
And Your Excellency, I know that the foundation has made science and the environment research very clear priorities. I wonder what you could convey to us about how you see the need for all of us to be engaged in accelerating progress on addressing climate change.
Yeah, so we've invested a lot in research when it comes to sustainability and climate change, and it's very heartening to see young girls and young boys taking on that challenge and knowing that it's also their responsibility to protect the earth. Right now, I feel like there's a values imbalance in society. It seems like those who can get the most are those who are on top. And we need to change that. We need to instill values, not just in our children, but even in ourselves, to understand that it's not about what you can get, but what you need to get, what's enough. And understanding that it's also not an individualistic act. We come from communities, we're born into communities, and we need to protect these communities. And we can't do so if we think of ourselves and only ourselves. And so it's not only on individuals, of course, it's on corporations, it's on government to understand we need to be satisfied with getting as much as we need as opposed to as much as we can get. I'm optimistic that the younger generation understand that fully. And it's on us to ensure that that's a sign of success for them as well. That success is not associated with the most money you can get, but actually it's about looking after your community or protecting the earth. And I know we're in an economic forum, and it's important for us to think about even rethinking the way we think about a successful economy. It will, of course, take generations, but the best time to do it is now, and we need to start somewhere. And the most important thing really is to look at those values and make sure that they're integrated within our lives.
Your Excellency, how do we, with the youth bulge, the large numbers of young people comprising the majority in some countries, particularly in the region, and there's great worry about how they will become employed and be productive and realize their potential. How can we ensure that they will be valued as a great resource and not worry about them as a problem?
I mean, it all starts with education. We need to give them access to quality education, and we need to make sure that we support them with the tools so that they don't have to, be employed in the government or seek a job in a company, but they can be entrepreneurs, and that has to be supported as well. The youth, to me, is a huge opportunity for development. They have the passion that we need. And of course, we need to couple it with the wisdom of the older generation. And the older generation need to understand how to use that passion to ensure that we continue to develop and we continue as a society to understand better how we can enhance the lives of everyone. So I'm not too concerned about the number of the young population, but of course we have to ensure that they've got these opportunities in place, and we support them as much as we can.
We have just a little bit over a minute left, and I wonder if I could ask each of you, both of you, what makes you optimistic? Our world is challenged in so many ways, and certainly economies are challenged, but what makes you optimistic? Secretary Clinton.
Well, Melanne, I would say three things. Number one, what both Her Excellency and I have talked about, young people. I really do feel like there is a generation of doers and activists and caring people that we can see going into the future. Secondly, science, facts, evidence. The way that the world, with its scientific know-how, came up with vaccines that are helping to stop this pandemic is extremely beneficial. And then finally, I think that there is a lot of serious rethinking going on. People are trying to ask themselves, and as Her Excellency said, how do we want to live coming out of this pandemic? I think that's a really fruitful, hopeful, optimistic conversation, and I hope we see some results from it.
Your Excellency?
Well, seeing the number of women having bachelor's degree all around the world continue to increase, that's incredibly important. And it shows us that the more women are going to be active in the workplace, which means that their narrative is going to be part of that. And they will try to change that and change the framework that we're currently operating in. And of course, the youth and seeing all the global social movements happening, it's incredible. And I hope to see that translate into real action by those who are in positions of authority.